Sleep is a truth that binds humanity together, a necessity from which not even kings or saints can escape. Yet in the winter of 1756, in the dimly lit streets of Dublin, whispers began to circulate of a man who defied that truth, a cobbler named Michael O'Dwyer. By every account, he did not sleep. By day he worked diligently at his trade, hammering leather and stitching boots with unshaking hands, and by night he wandered the cobbled lanes, muttering prayers under his breath, pacing like a man forever waiting for something, or fleeing from it. Neighbors spoke of the sound of his footsteps, relentless and rhythmic, echoing through the thin wooden walls until dawn. Some claimed his eyes never closed, never blinked, fixed instead upon something invisible, something hovering just beyond mortal sight. Market vendors whispered that he stood for hours in silence, staring through the glass of shopfront windows as though he saw another world within. Children were warned not to meet his gaze, for mothers said he carried shadows inside him. Others swore they heard him speak in voices not his own, sometimes harsh and guttural, sometimes soft and childlike, always unsettling, as if his body were a vessel borrowed by something unseen. What confounded everyone was his strength. Though he should have been crippled by exhaustion, his body endured. He walked without falter, worked without trembling, spoke without the slur of fatigue. The church declared his sleeplessness a mark of possession, arguing that demons denied him rest so they might use him as their instrument. Physicians, more cautious yet no less fascinated, described his condition as an unknown affliction, a medical anomaly that resisted every cure. They recorded his pulse, prescribed tonics, even bled him in hopes of calming the mind, but nothing brought him tourist. Instead, his legend grew, carried across taverns, markets, and parishes, until Michael O'Dwyer became more than a cobbler. He became a question. Was he cursed, chosen, or trapped in a body that betrayed the natural order? His story seeped into folklore, where it mingled with tales of restless spirits and eternal wanderers, and it remains alive even centuries later, half fact and half nightmare. For sleep is more than rest. It is surrender, the daily rehearsal of death. To live without it is to step outside of human boundaries, into a place where reason falters and the supernatural begins. This documentary does not claim to solve Michael's mystery. It seeks instead to follow his footsteps through history, to examine the records, the testimonies, the whispers, and the silences that surround him. Was Michael O'Dwyer a man suffering from a rare illness of the mind? Or was he something else entirely? A warning, a curse, a soul caught between waking and eternal unrest? The truth may have died with him, but his sleepless eyes remain open in Ireland's darkest memory. Michael O'Dwyer's beginnings were not the kind of story that demanded retelling, at least not at first glance. He was born in 1728 in a cramped tenement near Fishamble Street, a part of Dublin where the river's damp air clung to the stone, and poverty pressed into every household like a permanent guest. His father, a journeyman laborer, earned just enough to keep bread on the table, while his mother, a devout Catholic, poured her faith into prayers and parish duties. Parish registers confirm the baptism of a Michael, son of Patrick and Bridget O'Dwyer. On a rain-soaked January morning, a child welcomed into the church with holy water and blessings. Yet whispers that reached later generations claimed that even in the cradle, Michael was unlike other infants. Mothers in the building muttered that they never heard him cry at night. He lay still, his wide eyes reflecting candlelight, too calm, too watchful for a newborn. One midwife allegedly remarked that the child looked at her with the knowing of a grown man, though whether this was a fabrication created after his legend spread or a genuine remark written down and remembered remains uncertain. Still, it fit the narrative of a boy destined for strangeness, a child who from his earliest breath refused the rhythms of ordinary sleep. As Michael grew, the peculiarities of his restlessness became harder to ignore. At the age of 4, his mother reportedly confessed to the parish priest that the boy seemed incapable of lying down peacefully. While his siblings curled into sleep, Michael would wander from bed, padding barefoot across the cold floorboards, humming fragments of hymns or staring out the window at the night sky. His father, weary from labor, scolded him, sometimes with the strap, demanding he return to bed, but no punishment could still his wakefulness. Schoolmasters recorded him as an intelligent child, capable of reciting prayers and lessons with ease, yet noted his restless conduct, a phrase repeated more than once in the margins of school rolls. They described him tapping his quill without pause, shifting in his seat, watching his peers not with childish distraction but with an intensity that unsettled even adults. He was not disruptive in the usual sense. Rather, there was something about his unyielding attentiveness that made people nervous, as though he were always present, always listening, even in moments when others drifted into daydreams or fatigue. Dublin in the mid-18th century was a city of contrasts, a place where superstition and reason battled for dominance in the minds of its citizens. The Catholic Church, though suppressed by law and penal codes, held its faithful tightly, while Enlightenment thought trickled in through books, pamphlets, and the conversations of intellectuals in coffeehouses. For the poor and working class, life remained rooted in the rhythms of faith, confession, mass, prayers, and the invisible fears of curses, omens, and spirits. In this environment, Michael's sleepless nature was interpreted in multiple, sometimes conflicting ways. To his mother, it was a burden from God, a test of patience and faith, for she often described her son as a soul restless even in innocence. To neighbors, it was unsettling, and gossip followed him, that he had been born touched by spirits, that his wakefulness at night was an invitation to dark presences. Dubliners of the time feared the night, streets poorly lit, crime rampant, shadows, always moving, and the idea of a boy wandering his home in perpetual wakefulness fed unease. In his adolescence, Michael apprenticed to a cobbler, a trade common to those with little wealth but steady hands. By day, he worked quietly, his skill evident in the quality of his stitching and the durability of his soles. Apprenticeship records describe him as industrious, though fellow workers remarked on his peculiar endurance. He never paused for rest, never seemed drowsy after a day's labor. While others slumped by evening, Michael's energy remained constant, his hands working as steadily at dusk as they had at dawn. One journeyman later testified that he never saw Michael shut his eyes, not even for a moment, and that during their nights in the workshop dormitory, when others snored, Michael sat awake insolence, repairing shoes by candlelight or whispering prayers. His fellow apprentices, unnerved by this, avoided sleeping near him, for they claimed to wake in the night to find him staring at them from his bed, eyes unblinking, as if waiting. It was during these years that Dublin's fascination with science and medicine began to take hold. Physicians were experimenting with classification of diseases, of symptoms, of the very structure of the body. Sleep itself had not yet been studied in the modern sense. It was considered a natural necessity, but not a subject of deep medical inquiry. For some physicians, Michael's case became an oddity worth noting. One unnamed doctor, writing in a private letter preserved in Trinity College archives, referred to a young cobbler's apprentice who declares never to have known slumber, yet suffers no malady of fatigue. Such statements, Will suggest that Michael's sleeplessness was indeed observed by those outside his immediate community, enough to warrant speculation if not systematic study. But if science regarded him with curiosity, religion regarded him with suspicion. Catholic priests, already cautious of anything that hinted at the supernatural, saw danger in a man who seemed to defy the natural order established by God. Sleep was not merely rest. It was part of the cycle of creation, a nightly surrender that humbled mankind. To live without it was to live outside of divine design. Michael's confessions, if records are to be believed, often returned to the same theme. He could not, no matter how he tried, quiet his mind enough to drift into unconsciousness. He prayed for release, begged for dreams, yet found none. One priest wrote in a parish margin that Michael was a youth beset by temptations of the night, who wanders as though awaiting spirits. Such remarks added fuel to whispers of possession. By the time Michael entered adulthood fully and opened his own cobbler's stall, his sleeplessness had become the defining feature of his life. Customers noted his availability at all hours, claiming they could bring him boots at dawn or midnight and find him at his bench. His shutters, according to testimony decades later, were never closed. No candlelight glowed behind them, for he worked without. His eyes, it was said, adjusted to the dark in unnatural ways. This detail may have been embellishment, but it served. The growing legend that Michael was not entirely of the human pattern. Children passing by were warned not to linger at his window, for they might find his gaze fixed upon them, cold and unblinking, a man who watched without rest. Family accounts, though scarce, add a layer of tragic humanity to his tale. His sister, whose descendants later gave interviews in the 19th century, when his legend resurfaced, described him as kind but unreachable, a brother who seemed always present but never truly with them. She recalled nights when their mother wept, begging him to lie still, only to find him hours later standing at the foot of the bed, whispering prayers into the shadows. His sleeplessness was not a choice, nor even a defiance. It was an absolute inability to lose consciousness. He was trapped in waking, day after day, year after year, his mind and body bound to perpetual awareness. To understand Michael's significance, one must understand the cultural crossroads of Dublin in the mid-1700s. It was a city shaped by poverty and superstition, yet brushing against the Enlightenment's insistence on reason. The poor clung to tales of banshees, restless dead, and spirits that roamed the night, while physicians began writing treatises on nerves, melancholia, and the workings of the mind. Michael's life sat uneasily between these worlds. To the faithful, he was a cautionary tale, perhaps cursed for hidden sins or possessed by demons who denied him rest. To the curious minds of medicine, he was a living experiment, a rare phenomenon that seemed to prove the body capable of more than previously believed. To his neighbors, he was both, a man to be pitied, feared, and whispered about, a man whose refusal of sleep blurred the line between natural and unnatural. Legends grew around him, embroidered onto the fabric of his biography by frightened imaginations. Some claimed he was seen wandering graveyards at night, speaking softly to the dead, though no parish records confirm such acts. Others swore that animals avoided him, that dogs would not bark in his presence, that horses turned away from his approach. Still others insisted that when he prayed in church, the candles nearest him flickered out, as if the air around him were unsettled. Whether these tales were inventions of fearful neighbors or kernels of truth magnified by rumor, they shaped his reputation into something larger than life. And yet, behind the whispers, their chords, the testimonies, one truth remains undeniable. Michael O'Dwyer was a man who could not sleep. In a world where slumber was universal, where exhaustion crushed even the strongest laborer, he remained awake, caught between the rhythms of day and night without reprieve. Was he born cursed, touched by something beyond understanding, or was he suffering from a natural condition that his era lacked the tools to explain? History begins not with the supernatural or the sensational, but with the simple, devastating reality of a man who never closed his eyes to rest. That reality, ordinary, yet impossible, would lay the foundation for one of Ireland's most haunting mysteries. As the sun dipped below the slate rooftops of Dublin, Michael O'Dwyer's life diverged from that of ordinary men. While families shuttered windows, extinguished candles, and sank into slumber, O'Dwyer would step out into the frosted streets, his cobbler's apron still dusted with the day's leather shavings, his hands steady despite exhaustion that should have claimed him. Witnesses who lived in alleys nearby recalled the steady rhythm of his footsteps along cobblestones, a metronome against the quiet of the sleeping city. Children whispered of a pale figure standing outside windows, eyes unblinking, tracing patterns, with invisible fingers against glass, watching as they trembled beneath blankets, uncertain whether he was friend or phantom. These were not sporadic encounters but nightly rituals, repeated with relentless constancy, each step and pause catalogued by neighbors who could not understand why a man remained awake when the world around him succumbed to the familiar pull of darkness. Accounts vary on the precise nature of O'Dwyer's nocturnal wanderings. Some swore he whispered prayers under his breath, fragments of scripture delivered so rapidly that they seemed not words but incantations, a strange melody of devotion and obsession. Others claimed that he muttered passages backward, syllables inverted, as though some unseen force compelled him to unravel sacred text in defiance of normal understanding. Farmers who rose before dawn noted him in fields, pacing along hedgerows, occasionally stopping to trace lines in the dirt with a finger, then continuing as if guided by visions invisible to human eyes. Children who ventured out for early errands reported him lingering near fountains, eyes fixed on the water's reflection, murmuring fragments of conversation to an unseen companion. In every testimony, a tension emerged. The same actions could be seen as holy, protective, or deeply unsettling. O'Dwyer was at once a man, a guardian, a strange fixture of the night, and a subject of fear. Medical observers of the time struggled to interpret what they saw. Parish physicians and itinerant healers visited his home, noting the increasing pallor of his skin, the subtle tremor of his hands, and the relentless alertness of his gaze. Bloodshot eyes, veins pronounced beneath delicate skin, suggested to some that O'Dwyer suffered from a rare disorder of the nerves or circulation. Others argued he was consumed by a psychological condition, a strain upon the mind that no medication could alleviate. Records indicate that he was cooperative but evasive, insisting that he sought only companionship in silence, a statement that confounded observers who could not imagine the solace of isolation. The interplay between perceived illness and deliberate action complicated understanding. He appeared both victim and agent, both subject to forces beyond his control, and in command of his nocturnal ritual. Neighbors' interpretations diverged sharply, along the lines of faith and superstition. Some believed O'Dwyer had become a guardian, a watchful presence warding off thieves, spirits, or the darker impulses of the city. Witnesses recounted him passing quietly through streets known for crime, his gaze seeming to anticipate danger before it emerged. Occasionally, cats would flee from him, dogs would whine, yet no human interference was noted, a subtle proof of a protective force, or alternately a supernatural sign of his unnatural condition. Conversely, others feared him. His relentless vigilance, his muttered passages, and the spectral pallor of his face convinced some that sleeplessness had driven him to madness, that the cobbler had crossed a line from devotion into menace, his body animated by forces that were not entirely his own. O'Dwyer's interaction with the city extended beyond mere observation. Market vendors, returning home late, reported catching fragments of conversation in which he seemed to address empty doorways or shadows, phrases suggesting memory, longing, or perhaps warning. Street children, drawn by curiosity and courage, described moments of contact, his hand raised in silent greeting, a voice murmuring incomprehensible syllables, eyes that seemed simultaneously aware of them and distant. Yet, he rarely spoke directly to adults in authority. Priests, constables, and tradesmen often found him polite but reticent, a man whose speech was measured and deliberate, as if he knew that certain knowledge must remain contained. The duality of these accounts, innocent engagement with some, eerie menace to others, blurred lines between sanity and madness, protection and threat. Contemporary chroniclers noted the physical consequences of perpetual wakefulness. Muscles remained toned, yet exhibited micro-tremors. Facial features sharpened to an almost gaunt precision. Lips cracked as if the skin could not rest. He consumed minimal food at night, subsisting largely on bread and water, yet stamina persisted, a contradiction that confounded physicians. Night after night, he circled familiar streets and empty fields, a figure untouched by fatigue yet increasingly alien to those around him. The same streets that once echoed with the chatter of neighbors now resonated with the rhythmic tapping of O'Dwyer's boots on cobblestones, a pulse in the heart of Dublin's sleeping quarters, a measure of time kept by a single unblinking observer. Some theorists, both contemporary and modern, suggested that O'Dwyer's vigil served a purpose beyond the physiological. In a city shaped by superstition, crime, and spiritual tension, his constant presence might have functioned as a subconscious guardian, protecting neighborhoods through sheer vigilance. Others proposed darker interpretations. Sleeplessness could have been a catalyst for aberrant behavior, an erosion of moral and cognitive restraint, a liminal state in which a man could oscillate between saintly protection and hidden menace. This ambiguity became central to his legend, transforming him from a mere cobbler to a symbol of tension between reason and superstition, human endurance, and the intrusion of the unknown. Accounts of his nightly wanderings were codified in parish journals, medical letters, and later folklore, often contradicting one another. Some described him crossing the River Liffey under moonlight without hesitation. Others claimed he could pass through alleyways unseen, a spectral figure moving between shadows and light. Children's rhymes, passed down for decades, referenced a pale man who never slept, whose gaze could pierce doors and walls, who muttered prayers both comforting and terrifying. These stories, while anecdotal, reflected a consistent theme. Michael O'Dwyer's wakefulness transformed him from an ordinary man into a fixture of collective consciousness, a nightly paradox both familiar and alien. By reconstructing these accounts alongside medical observation, a portrait emerges of a man who occupied a space between devotion and obsession, between sanity and the unknown. His condition challenged every understanding of human endurance available in 18th century Dublin. While some saw guardian, others saw danger. While some saw miracle, others saw madness. The streets of Dublin at night became both stage and witness, the city itself a silent audience to the vigil of a man whose life was defined not by sleep but by the relentless haunting persistence of wakefulness. The case of Michael O'Dwyer soon transcended local curiosity, drawing the attention of physicians, scholars, and clergy alike, each eager to interpret his inexplicable wakefulness. Dublin, in the mid-18th century, was a city balancing the rigor of emerging science against the pervasive authority of the Church. Physicians arrived from the city's hospitals and beyond, armed with herbal remedies, distilled tonics, and rudimentary experiments, determined to force sleep upon a man who appeared incapable of succumbing to its pull. They monitored his meals, his walking, his interactions, and even attempted mild sedatives, yet each measure failed. Night after night, O'Dwyer's eyes remained alert, his limbs unwavering, his mind lucid. For the medical community, HEP presented both an opportunity and a dilemma. Either the man embodied a previously unknown disorder, or the phenomena were an elaborate deception. Skepticism coexisted uneasily with fascination, and letters exchanged between physicians reveal heated debates over methodology, observation, and the ethics of experimentation on a human subject whose plight defied comprehension. Yet science did not have free rein. Clergy from Dublin's parishes, informed by the same accounts circulating among neighbors, voiced fierce opposition to medical interference. To priests, O'Dwyer's sleeplessness was not a curiosity to be dissected, but a divine sign, perhaps punishment or test, demanding spiritual attention rather than chemical intervention. Attempts to sedate him, they argued, were an intrusion upon God's plan, risking moral as well as physical harm. Parish sermons included veiled references to his condition, cautioning congregants against meddling with forces they could not understand. O'Dwyer himself felt caught between these realms. At times he submitted to physicians' potions, later, confessing to priests the unease that stirred within him, whether to seek relief through human science or to endure his wakefulness as a burden ordained by the divine. His own words, recorded in fragments of testimony, reveal a man aware of his liminality, neither fully of the earthly nor entirely of the spiritual world, and struggling to reconcile the two. Rumors and folklore quickly entwined with scientific and religious discourse. Among the city's poorer neighborhoods, whispers circulated that O'Dwyer had been cursed at birth, marked by a banshee who had foreseen calamity in his bloodline. Others claimed he had bartered his dreams to the devil in exchange for eternal vigilance, that his wakefulness was a covenant written in shadow. Children muttered rhymes about the pale cobbler who walks while the world sleeps, while adults exchanged tales in taverns of his encounters with strange figures at night, some claiming spectral apparitions accompanied him on his walks. The mixture of fear, reverence, and fascination fueled the legend, making it difficult for scholars to separate fact from embellishment. Local chroniclers attempted to document these accounts systematically, noting both the physiologically observable phenomena, bloodshot eyes, tremulous hands, and unbroken routines, and then narratives that painted him as otherworldly. This duality became central to understanding how communities interpreted extraordinary behavior through lenses of faith, superstition, and the yet unformed methodologies of empirical science. Physicians attempting to study O'Dwyer were confronted with numerous challenges. Observation proved complicated, as his adherence to routine was meticulous yet unpredictable. He might walk for hours in one neighborhood, then retreat to shadowed alleys for unknown purposes. Early sleep studies were rudimentary. Doctors timed his blinking, measured pulse after exertion, and recorded responses to herbal sedatives. One account describes an attempted opium tincture that failed to induce even drowsiness, leaving observers aghast. Some speculated the cobbler's nervous system operated at an unprecedented threshold, a biological anomaly impervious to sedatives or natural fatigue. Others raised concerns about psychosomatic resistance, noting that O'Dwyer's belief in the necessity of wakefulness might have created a mental barrier to sleep. By contrast, priests and spiritual observers posited that divine or demonic forces sustained him, suggesting that attempts to override these forces were morally and spiritually dangerous. The tension between these viewpoints created an intellectual battlefield in which O'Dwyer became both subject and symbol, a living test of competing paradigms. The debate extended to philosophical and ethical considerations. Physicians argued for empirical evidence, measurement, observation, and replication as the means to understand the human body. Clergy invoked moral law, obedience, repentance, and deference to divine design as safeguards against hubris. Folklorists and storytellers introduced yet another layer, blending myth and morality, suggesting that sleeplessness carried both reward and consequence, protection and peril. O'Dwyer's case, therefore, cannot be reduced to physiology alone. It occupied a liminal space between reason and faith, scientific curiosity and human imagination. Every new observation was refracted through multiple interpretive lenses, leaving observers uncertain whether they bore witness to a natural anomaly, a supernatural occurrence, or the psychological strain of social isolation amplified by folklore. O'Dwyer's own comportment reflected this tension. He sometimes cooperated with experiments, submitting to measurement and observation, while at other times withdrawing entirely, wandering streets silently, and refusing to engage with either physicians or clergy. His actions suggested awareness of the gaze upon him, yet a profound resistance to control, neither fully surrendering to medical authority nor entirely to spiritual guidance. Contemporaneous letters note his articulate defenses. He expressed a desire to maintain autonomy, to observe the world without the interruption of sleep, as if wakefulness itself was both burden and duty. This ambiguity intensified the mythos surrounding him. Was he a man demonstrating remarkable physiology, or a soul caught between mortal and divine forces, resisting the ordinary rules of human life? Even decades later, historians struggle to categorize O'Dwyer's case. His unbroken nocturnal vigilance challenged 18th-century medicine and theology alike. Folklore, anecdotal records, and early clinical notes intertwine, each refracting a different interpretation. Modern analysis proposes hypotheses ranging from extreme insomnia to psychophysiological anomalies, yet no definitive evidence can confirm the truth. The narratives surrounding him illustrate a broader cultural struggle, a city and era grappling with the boundaries of human experience, the authority of science, and the enduring power of superstition. O'Dwyer was not merely a medical curiosity or a spectral figure. He was a living intersection of competing truths, embodying the tension between reason and belief, mortality and myth. Across Dublin, the memory of Michael O'Dwyer persisted precisely because no single explanation sufficed. Physicians documented physiology, priests invoked morality, and neighbors whispered folklore, but all failed to account for the totality of his existence. He remained awake, a paradox unresolvable by empirical evidence or divine decree. The city itself became an observer, a participant in a legend that blurred human, supernatural, and psychological dimensions. In this tension between knowledge and myth, science and superstition, O'Dwyer's sleeplessness achieved immortality, an enduring question mark in the history of human experience. Section 4. The Decline. 2,000 words. By the early 1760s, Michael O'Dwyer's existence had begun to fray at its edges, his body and mind showing the inevitable toll of decades without rest. Neighbors observed him wandering the cobbled streets of Dublin in the hours before dawn, his form gaunt, his eyes wide and bloodshot, yet still alert, with a gaze that seemed to pierce not only the night, but the souls of those who dared watch him. His movements, once purposeful and measured, became erratic. He would stop abruptly, muttering incomprehensible phrases, then continue as if nothing had interrupted him. Some claimed they saw him lean against walls for support, his hands trembling violently as if trying to hold together the fragile vessel of his worn-out body. Children, who had once been fascinated or terrified by his sleepless vigil, now recoiled at the intensity of his stare, describing a figure simultaneously human and inhuman, a living embodiment of exhaustion without fatigue. O'Dwyer's family grew increasingly desperate as his decline became visible in the most ordinary domestic spaces. In the modest rooms of his home, they witnessed him speaking to unseen figures, pointing at shadows that others could not perceive, and reciting scripture in jumbled sequences that seemed to be some inner logic known only to him. Accounts describe him naming distant streets as if he had traveled them in dreams that never came, recounting conversations he could not have heard, or predicting events that unsettled his relatives with their eerie accuracy. The distinction between hallucination and premonition blurred, leaving his family to grapple with fear, guilt, and helplessness. Despite their pleas, physicians of the day could offer little beyond observation. The medical texts then available recognized sleeplessness as a symptom, not a disease, and no known remedy existed for the extreme endurance O'Dwyer displayed. His case defied not only treatment, but comprehension, challenging physicians' faith in the body's limits and in the efficacy of their own craft. Clergy became involved, perceiving in O'Dwyer's condition the marks of a soul under siege. Priests attempted exorcisms, entering his rooms with prayers, holy water, and ritual gestures, intended to expel any malevolent influence. Witnesses reported that during these ceremonies, O'Dwyer's voice shifted inexplicably, alternating between his own tones and ones that were deep, guttural, and unrecognizable. At times, he recited phrases that seemed older than contemporary. Dublin, invoking words and syntax that suggested knowledge of forgotten liturgies or occult formulas. The effect on observers was profound. Some claimed the exorcisms provoked violent thrashing, while others insisted he remained eerily calm, as if communing with forces unseen. These events heightened the tension between medical reasoning and religious interpretation. Doctors emphasized neurological decay and fatigue, while priests framed the manifestations as evidence of demonic or spiritual activity, insisting that the body and soul were inseparable in suffering. As weeks and months passed, O'Dwyer's physical appearance worsened dramatically. Once capable of sustained movement, he was eventually found collapsed in the streets, still awake, unable to walk or support himself. His skin had taken on a pallid, almost waxen hue, veins pronounced beneath thinning flesh, and his limbs trembled incessantly. The extraordinary endurance of his sleepless body had come at a cost. Muscles weakened, organs strained, and his once sharp mind began to fragment. Yet his eyes retained a striking intensity. Even in his most debilitated moments, he appeared aware, as if observing the world on a level beyond ordinary perception. Neighbors remarked that in these final stages, he looked simultaneously alive and spectral, his presence straddling the line between corporeal being and apparition, a living warning of the consequences of prolonged sleeplessness. Descriptions of his visions intensified during this decline. O'Dwyer spoke of burning fields where flames consumed the innocent and grotesque forms rose from water, faceless children drowning silently before his gaze. Some saw these accounts as evidence of hallucinations, the mind's desperate attempt to generate narrative in the absence of sleep. Others interpreted them as prophetic glimpses, a cursed clairvoyance emerging from the unnatural state of his body and spirit. He often recounted encounters with shadowy figures at the foot of his bed, silent observers who seemed to weigh his actions, monitor his thoughts, or even guide him through some hidden path. The ambiguity between symptom and revelation troubled his observers, prompting endless speculation. Were these visions neurological artifacts, religious metaphors, or evidence of a mystical reality just beyond ordinary perception. The social response to O'Dwyer's decline reflected broader anxieties in 18th-century Dublin about madness, divine punishment, and unseen threats. Citizens viewed his half-conscious peregrinations with a mixture of fascination and dread. Rumors, spread of curses, pacts with infernal powers, and divine tests, amplifying the public's perception of him as a man whose very being threatened the natural order. Families warned their children to avoid the streets where he roamed. Merchants described lost business during nights when he passed through market lanes. Even those sympathetic to his suffering could not escape fear. O'Dwyer became a symbol of the fragile boundary between human endurance and spiritual peril, a living example of what might happen when one's body defies natural laws. Ultimately, his decline culminated in his sudden death. Found one morning, still upright, eyes open and body rigid, he displayed the paradox that had defined his life, awake in death as he had been awake in life. The rigidity of his form suggested prolonged physiological stress, yet the intensity in his gaze-fueled stories of lingering consciousness, as though he retained awareness even beyond the mortal plane. Accounts from neighbors and family emphasized the disquieting persistence of his presence, asserting that he seemed to watch events unfold after death, a silent witness to Dublin's ongoing life. His passing did not quell speculation. Rather, it intensified the mythos surrounding him, cementing Michael O'Dwyer as both historical anomaly and enduring symbol of the uncanny. O'Dwyer's decline illustrates more than the effects of sleeplessness. It exposes the interplay of human biology, psychology, faith, and societal perception. His suffering was not merely personal, it became a canvas for Dubliners' fears, a test case for emerging medical theories, and a focal point for religious interpretation. In every act, from wandering streets to speaking in alien voices, had challenged contemporary notions of sanity, divine favor, and the limits of the human body. The combination of physical deterioration, vivid visions, and unwavering vigilance ensured that his story would resonate far beyond his lifetime, leaving a legacy of fear, fascination, and unresolved mystery. Even in death, his presence cast a shadow. Stories persisted of cold drafts in his former rooms, footsteps echoing without source, and a gaze that seemed to linger upon any who dared enter spaces he had frequented. Dublin's memory of O'Dwyer became inseparable from its streets, its lore, and its understanding of the fine line between human endurance and supernatural encounter. The decline of the sleepless man exemplifies the terror and wonder inspired by one individual who defied the natural rhythm of life and challenged society's understanding of consciousness, mortality, and spiritual reality. Even centuries after Michael O'Dwyer's death, scholars, folklorists, psychologists, and occultists remain captivated by the perplexing case of the sleepless man of Dublin. His life and decline straddle a liminal space between medical anomaly, religious cautionary tale, and folkloric legend, leaving modern observers to grapple with the enduring question: was he a man of flesh and blood, a vessel of disease, or a vessel for something beyond human comprehension? The difficulty in arriving at a singular explanation lies not only in the extraordinary nature of his sleeplessness, but also in the convergence of testimony, myth, and cultural imagination that surrounded him. Medical researchers often frame O'Dwyer's case through the lens of rare sleep disorders. Fatal familial insomnia, a hereditary neurodegenerative disease, is one candidate. Though typically identified in the modern era, the characteristics described by contemporary observers, progressive sleeplessness, cognitive decline, hallucinations, and eventual death, align disturbingly well with this condition. Symptoms such as tremors, pallor, and weight loss, noted repeatedly in parish records and eyewitness accounts, suggest a systematic physiological deterioration, consistent with chronic sleep deprivation compounded by neurological degeneration. Some physicians propose that other conditions, like undiagnosed epilepsy or extreme anxiety disorders, could also account for fragmented cognition and obsessive behaviors, potentially explaining his nocturnal wandering, muttering, and heightened alertness. Even with these explanations, the precise endurance of his body and mind, surviving decades without conventional sleep, challenges known medical limits and leaves gaps in any purely scientific interpretation. Psychologists contribute another perspective, seeing O'Dwyer as perhaps the earliest documented case of severe psychiatric disorder, such as schizophrenia. Reports of hallucinations, visions of faceless figures, burning fields, drowned children, mirror the symptomatology of psychosis, in which the mind fabricates alternate realities under extreme stress or neurological instability. Similarly, his repetitive speech, compulsive pacing, and whispered conversations with unseen entities echo documented signs of paranoia, obsessive-compulsive behavior, and dissociative experiences. Psychologists argue that his isolation, both social and occupational, would have amplified these symptoms, creating a feedback loop where sleeplessness and mental disturbance reinforced one another. Yet this framework still leaves questions unresolved. His physical endurance exceeded expectations for someone with severe psychological disorder, and multiple independent witnesses attested to seeing him maintain wakefulness over decades. In this way, psychological theory explains some behaviors, but cannot entirely account for the phenomenon that made him unique. Folklorists emphasize the cultural context in which O'Dwyer lived, noting parallels between his story and Celtic myths of ever-watchful figures cursed to wander eternally. These archetypes often serve as moral or cautionary narratives, blending fear and respect for the supernatural with communal explanations for human misfortune. Tales of restless spirits, nocturnal guardians, and individuals marked by unseen powers resonate in Irish oral history, suggesting that O'Dwyer's legend emerged partly from a need to contextualize his inexplicable endurance within familiar narrative frameworks. In these accounts, the sleepless man is both feared and revered, a mediator between the living and the supernatural, embodying anxieties about mortality, divine retribution, and the limits of human comprehension. Occultists take yet another approach, interpreting O'Dwyer's visions and nighttime mutterings as evidence of initiation into secret or forbidden practices. His recitation of backward scripture, engagement with shadowy figures, and apparent knowledge of events he could not have, observed are framed as signs that he had access to hidden truths. The occasional invocation of arcane terminology or unknown prayers recorded by witnesses is seen as corroborating evidence that he operated under the influence of forces beyond ordinary perception. These theories, though speculative, highlight the degree to which his life has been interpreted through lenses of mystery, fear, and the supernatural. Despite centuries of analysis, no single theory resolves all anomalies. Medical explanations account for some physical deterioration. Psychological theories rationalize hallucinations and erratic behavior. Folkloric interpretations explain narrative persistence and social perception. Occultist readings provide insight into cultural fears of hidden knowledge. Yet the most remarkable aspects, his perpetual wakefulness, extraordinary endurance, and the consistency of independent witness accounts, remain unexplained. Dublin locals continue to claim that O'Dwyer's spirit haunts the city's streets. Tourists and residents report fleeting glimpses of a pale figure pacing along the old cobblestones, muttering prayers under the moonlight, and vanishing before direct observation is possible. These accounts, whether rooted in memory, imagination, or spectral phenomena, underscore the lasting power of his story. In the end, Michael O'Dwyer embodies the tension between fact and legend, science and superstition, reality and perception. He challenges assumptions about human biology, consciousness, and the interplay of culture and personal experience. His legacy persists in medical curiosity, folklore, and paranormal speculation, ensuring that Dublin's sleepless man remains a figure of both historical and mythic significance. Perhaps he was an extraordinary human subject, or perhaps he was a vessel for something greater, a liminal figure straddling the boundaries of life, death, and legend. What is certain is that the story refuses closure. It lingers in the shadows of streets, in the whispers of neighbors, and in the imaginations of those who dare to question the limits of reality. Michael Dwyer's case reminds us that some mysteries resist resolution, compelling us to confront the unknown, and leaving an enduring shadow over the city he never left. Michael O'Dwyer, the sleepless man of Dublin, remains a figure who defies simple categorization. His life is preserved in fragmented parish records, eyewitness testimonies, and medical notes, yet it has grown into a narrative that blurs the line between history and legend. Observers across generations have struggled to reconcile the mundane details of his existence, a cobbler by trade, a neighbor in a bustling city, with the extraordinary nature of his sleeplessness. Was he simply a man afflicted by an unknown physiological condition, or was he something more, a vessel for phenomena beyond ordinary comprehension? The Church, steeped in fear and moral authority, pronounced him marked by demons, interpreting his endless wakefulness as both punishment and a sign of spiritual corruption. Physicians, experimenting within the fledgling frameworks of medicine and psychiatry, documented his body and behavior as an anomaly, yet even their interventions could not bring him relief. Folklore and cultural memory have amplified O'Dwyer's mystique, transforming him into an archetype of the ever-watchful or the cursed wanderer, a figure whose story serves both as caution and fascination. Local legends insist his ghost still roams Dublin streets muttering prayers under the moonlight, appearing briefly in alleyways before disappearing into the shadows. These tales, passed from one generation to the next, ensure that the boundary between fact and imagination remains deliberately porous. Psychologists and neurologists today may offer plausible explanations: fatal familial insomnia, epilepsy, or early-onset psychiatric conditions. Yet these theories cannot fully account for the consistency of eyewitness accounts describing him moving, observing, and speaking as if untouched by the exhaustion that defines human life. His endurance challenges everything known about human physiology, creating a space where science meets the inexplicable. Even in death, O'Dwyer's presence haunted those around him. Reports of his body found rigid, eyes open, and expression unyielding contribute to the narrative of a man who never truly rested, even as the city around him continued its rhythms. His visions, mutterings, and nocturnal wanderings became entangled with Dublin's fears of madness, divine punishment, and unseen forces. In examining his life, one confronts not only the mystery of his sleeplessness, but also the human impulse to explain the unexplainable, through medicine, religion, folklore, or myth. O'Dwyer remains a mirror, reflecting society's anxieties, hopes, and limitations. Perhaps he was a man, a fragile human body tested to its absolute limits by an unknown disorder. Perhaps he was a myth, a story cultivated by a city grappling with the intersection of faith, science, and superstition. Or perhaps he still walks, a spectral witness to human vulnerability and the limits of understanding, challenging us to question what we accept as reality. Michael O'Dwyer's life and legend refuse closure, compelling us to linger in doubt, uncertainty, and awe.